Great, we're live. And thank you for joining us. My name is Sean Johnson Andrews, and I'm your host and the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association. I'm broadcasting to you today from the north side of Chicago. And unfortunately, my co-host Rob Carley is unable to join this morning. He has two sick kids in need of doctor visits, so we're sending healing vibes to South Texas. Thanks for joining us for our 5th episode of Breaking Culture Live. This program is an experiment in scholarly communication. Every Wednesday around lunchtime in Chicago and New York, or brunch time on the west coast of the U.S., we spend about half an hour and about 40 minutes lately breaking down the breaking news with cultural studies scholars and activists discussing their work and how it helps us to understand a contemporary event or emerging trend, and to intervene in making the world a better place. So for the next 2 episodes, we'll be talking about different aspects of AI and culture. This week, we're going to be chatting generally about how artificial intelligence industry is running, and also how that integrates, how educational institutions are integrating it or not. So we're joined by 2 colleagues. First, we're going to be speaking with Marcus Breen, who is a journalist, teacher, and scholar of media and communication. He's written for The Hollywood Reporter, Music Business International, as well as a variety of other magazine, newspaper, and community radio stations in Australia and around the world. He's author of several academic monographs and dozens of scholarly articles and book chapters, including several in CSA's journal Lateral. His most recent book is UPRISING, The Internet's Unintended Consequences, and he currently teaches in the communication department at Boston University and is producer and host for the Boston Media Theory TV program, whose episodes are also archived on YouTube. Welcome, Marcus. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And I know you've been thinking about this quite a bit. We're hoping to also be joined by Brian Alexander, who is an internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher working in the field of how technology transforms education. He should be joining us in a few minutes. But first, we're gonna speak with Marcus. Marcus, this is a rather capacious topic for sure, education and AI. But I think, as we were talking right before the show, many of the tensions running through these conversations are somewhat evergreen, right? These are, artificial intelligence, especially as a consumer-facing platform. These are relatively new technologies, but its potential promises and perils speak to long-standing utopian dreams of having technologies that will eliminate work or workers, provide accurate information in an instant, and be smart and savvy enough to replace or even go beyond human intelligence. So it definitely echoes things like the dot-com bubble. So before we consider the ways that people are integrating into education, I'm interested in getting your take on the political economic environment. I know you've been looking at the larger landscape of this industry and its potential for being a major component in a bubble. One data point here that stood out to me was a gaffe last week where an OpenAI executive suggested their business model might need a government backstop to be maintained. So I'm interested in kind of getting your take on that political economic environment, first of all.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks for the invitation to talk about political economy. I'm delighted to have that opportunity. I think it's often an underrepresented area of cultural studies, which is a point I've made in writing and elsewhere. And I've been engaged in the kind of relationship between culture, cultural studies, Marxist critical theory, and institutional economics, which is somewhat, let's say, shriveled on the vine and is certainly under attack because it involves the idea that institutions have a particular role to play in establishing some kind of justice and equity within capitalism, and that capitalism, in fact, can be engaged in a more directed, if you like, sense of the productive forces at work for everybody. So that's a sort of socialist take on those kinds of political economic considerations. For artificial intelligence, political economy is everything, just like it is with all communication and media forms. And one of the points I'd like to make is firstly not only the ubiquity of the internet, but then the ubiquity of the rhetoric and the promotion of artificial intelligence. That is, it is everywhere and it is going to be everywhere. And that's a
Yeah.
point. That's what they want. That's what the owners and the advocates of this technology want. So the political economy
Yeah,
of
it feels like everything it's integrated into everything, and it's supposed to be integrated into everything, right? I'm actually here on Zoom. There's this AI assistant that I don't have any idea what it's supposed to do or why I need it, and I'm not sure that Zoom does either. But there's this sort of idea that it needs to be there, that's adding value to the platform, and that I, as a user, should also feel like I should use it because that's going to add value to whatever I do. So
well, of
it's
course, and doesn't it? Is the
I don't know. It's I
no,
mean,
no, no.
it can provide if I turn it on, it will tell me a summary of what was discussed in a Zoom call. Um, but that I'm not sure. I feel like there's something else that's happening in a Zoom call that is not captured by an AI summary. So
Exactly. And in the political economy approach, there's a lot to be done, a lot of work to be done in exploring what Amber Ross calls the opacity or the opaque nature of technology. And this happens even in the models that are offered of AI, where the central processing features, where the highly advanced computer code is operational, is still largely opaque. In other words, nobody really knows what is going on in that. And this is just old news now, but even if you ask people in the industry, they'll say, well, they don't really know how it works. I don't believe that as it happens. I think the first rule of the industrial sector, particularly the hyper commodifying industrial sector of the digital economy, is the rule that says do not tell the truth. Now, of course, this is just American business at work, so why would we expect anything else? But I suspect that putting together opacity or the opaque nature of what we don't know about the AI industry and its real functions, and then the history of American business, and it is an American business, are two rather nefarious
mhm,
considerations or objects for
totally.
consideration.
Well, and as we see right now in the economy or the AI economy, we have some major players, and many of their investments are being made in a rather circular way. So, OpenAI investing in NVIDIA, who makes the chips, and then NVIDIA, who makes the chips and helps to sort of stock these massive data centers. Also, then going back and investing in OpenAI, and on both ends, it sort of inflates those prices and makes it seem like they're more valuable than they might otherwise be and more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And the valuations are phenomenal. We know this from NVIDIA. We know this from the Tesla case. This sort of fantasy world of the stock market, which is not the real economy, let's remember that, is deeply disturbing. I was just checking before we came on here, and Gartner, the advisory and consultancy firm for which I used to work, Gartner has suggested that there's been $1.5 trillion in investments this year in artificial intelligence. Now, $1.5 trillion is a lot of bananas
Yeah, it is.
and or peanuts, even more if you're counting peanuts, but it's a hell of a lot of money. And if you follow this on either in the pages of the New York Times, which has pretty good financial reporting, the Wall Street Journal, which is pretty good, or the Financial Times, the three papers that I look at, thanks to Boston College, which subsidizes my subscriptions, I am able to identify a significant panic in the financial world about this misallocation of resources into this sector. And this really draws us into major questions about political economy of communication And the approach that I use, which is derived from the structuration or sociology approach, and structuration first proposed way back in the 1980s by Anthony Giddens, I should say, The Constitution of Society, that book. And I have my students at Boston College read sections of that book, which basically outlines the structure and agency question. And then what Vincent Mosco did in the communications environment was to take structuration and redefine it, but recognizing the potential for agency once the people, as it were, or users mobilize their engagement with those technologies. So it's not just about disempowering ourselves in terms of Moscow's notion of structuration. It's about how the industry can provide resources in the communication and media environment for people to find each other and to work and collaborate and engage in solidarity. So that has to temper my pessimism about the world in general. And you've seen my pessimism in action, Sean, at the last Cultural Studies Association meeting.
Sure.
When I talked about this, you looked a bit pale when you left the room after my talk. I didn't.
Well, I don't recall. I'm sure I just needed a snack.
It
But
probably
no,
wasn't
I
all
think
good
that,
snacks.
yeah, they had good snacks there always. No,
But the point
and
I made, and the point I got to, and the point I'm still working through is this notion, which is a kind of visualization of the problem or the challenge, and that is moving from culture to culture. Right? In other words, we once had culture, right? Well, we do have culture, the way we live, the artifacts that we produce that we love and that represent us and that we struggle around and over, all right, all that sort of good cultural studies guff. And then we're moving to culture, right? So the U in culture is replaced by the AI. So from
oh,
culture, we go to
okay.
culture.
All right. I was
Right.
trying to figure out what the word was. Cature.
Yeah,
Okay.
CAITURE. So
Right.
this is where the entirety of cultural experience is at a point of being defined by the AI technology, by the algorithms, if you like, that constrain and limit how culture might be defined. And this has some terrifying implications and complications. There's a lovely article by Andrew Patterson in the journal AI and Society, and it proposes a notion of knowledge collapse. So if we're talking about education, we can see how going from culture to culture, sorry, from culture to culture, literally as Patterson describes it, restrains or constrains the way that knowledge is circulated because AI cannot engage the full range of human experience and, if you like, cognitive processing, even though it tries to, but it cannot do it. And so in order to, if you like, simplify human relationships with the machine, Peterson's argument is there's a knowledge collapse. There is less knowledge available. Now, for educators, and particularly those of us in cultural studies and the humanities, this should be approaching the level of terror, of terrifying, because it will mean that if there is a reliance on AI, then what is being defined as suitable knowledge is this rather than this.
And I'm very familiar with that sort of pessimistic outlook, and uh, part of me also wonders though how much the pessimism uh, gives credit to the optimism of the AI sort of boosters, right? So
Yeah.
I was one of the things, and hopefully Brian will be able to join us. But one of the things that uh, that uh, that he looked at in the last environmental scan was a survey or a paper actually that Microsoft published doing from a survey of workers asking them what they use AI for. And the overwhelming response was that they use it for what they call information retrieval, and by many numbers of magnitude over anything else that they're using AI for, which just suggests that mostly what they're using AI for is what they used to use search for. And so, certainly there's issues with that, but maybe giving a lot of credit to this, or substantial belief in the power of AI is also maybe a step too far. I'm not sure.
My view on this is that the political economy of the industry has also collapsed. In other words, the digital industry is largely collapsing into artificial intelligence. And for those of us with a historical materialist perspective, of course, this is merely the continuation of the history of communication playing out. And what is playing out is that the large players that have been already made massively influential and powerful by their engagement through social media platforms and also through the acquisition of other platforms, such as Meta, Google,
Sure.
Microsoft, and so on, are indeed fundamentally the same companies, monopolizing and then reducing the capacity of new entrants into the area. And these are all private companies with particular objectives, that is profit maximization and monopoly focused. And so that, the simple reality, if you like, is that the companies themselves are antithetical to any kind of traditional liberal democratic notion of a competitive environment. And this is the environment that no longer exists in the United States because Mr. Trump and the reactionary rump, and I'll get to that in a minute, do not want regulation, and they want US domination. And if folk haven't seen this book, they can check out the kind of
Empire of AI. Yes.
Empire of AI, the new literature that's emerging about the way that the company AI and the owner of that, or the CEO of that, Sam Altman, has very clear objectives in establishing, monopoly domination worldwide, with the exception of China, thank goodness. And China, by the way, has an open source system. It doesn't have a
Sure.
closed private
This
system.
is a
That's what
DeepSeek, I think, is
DeepSeek.
this
That's right.
DeepSeek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a DeepSeek. So it's a different thing. But the political economy of this is quite disturbing, and it also follows the trajectory that emerged in the 1990s, when shamefully I worked in promoting the internet, mostly in Mexico, Australia, and Mexico and Latin America, and but I also promoted regulation, so I've got a little bit of a let out there. But the fact of the matter is that what we saw in any chart we look at will show that as the extraction of data and wealth, and that sort of conflation of data was also about wealth creation, increased, and there were more users, so there were fewer and fewer owners, and they became richer and richer. We know that. So there's a massive disequilibrium, if you like, in the system, which deserves to blow up, frankly, because fewer and fewer people own more and more of the wealth. And if you look at those people, they're almost without exception in the digital space, or they're people behind the scenes with old money who are putting money into that venture capital enterprise.
Yeah, and one of the, I'm not sure of your kind of how much this is included in. I know you're teaching a new course on, or I guess it's a course you've taught a couple of times on artificial intelligence in the evolving crisis. But one of the other spaces that we're seeing this is in the military-industrial complex with Palantir and these other kind of major venture capital-backed in military contractors trying to use AI to kind of rejigger how the Defense Department runs, how it targets people, how it kind of develops its planning. The idea that this would be instead of buying planes, you'd be buying Palantir.
Right. And Palantir has been set loose on the American public too. People should be aware of that, to collect data and to refine surveillance of the American public. The other thing, of course, is that Palantir and similar AI-focused technologies were and are continuing to be used on the people of Gaza.
Yes.
An outrageous application of a technology that's supposed to do good. It does no good in that situation. Can I also make a point here about the kind of cultural considerations that are playing out within that power structure that we should be paying attention to within cultural studies? because we want to know and we want to critique the way in which the fundamental ideological structures of the world are influenced and then how they are changed, usually against the people, right? Usually against democratic participation. And I'm not sure whether folk are familiar with the rather perverse subterranean discourse that's going on in Silicon Valley that's associated with Curtis Yarvin.
Sure.
I'm not
Yes.
sure, this sort of neo-reactionary, all kings are good kind of rhubarb. But Yarvin, there's a very nice profile called that's a picture of him there. Not sure I really want to put a picture of him, but there he is.
Yes.
Wistful little deer that he is. Anyway,
Yes.
this article in the New Yorker from June the 9th was very instructive. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just read the first paragraph because it has enormous amount of relevance to education.
Okay.
Ava Kaufman is the writer or journalist. In the spring and summer of 2008, when Donald Trump was still a registered Democrat, an anonymous blogger known as Mencius Moldbug posted a serial manifesto under the heading, quote, "An open letter to open-minded progressives." Written with the sneering disaffection of an ex-believer, the 120,000-word letter argued that egalitarianism, far from improving the world, was actually responsible for most of its ills. That his bien passant readers thought otherwise, Moldberg contended, was due to the influence of the media and the academy, of course,
Yes.
which worked together, however unwittingly, to perpetuate a left liberal consensus. Could have fooled me, but that's another thing. Back to the article, to this nefarious alliance, he gave the name Cathedral. Moldberg called for nothing less than its destruction and a total reboot of the social order. And this is where I think this gets a little bit anxiety-inducing, because he proposed, quote, "the liquidation of democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law," end quote, and the eventual transfer of power to a CEO in chief, someone like Steve Jobs, who's moved on to greener pastures, and Mark Andreessen, who's a major venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And they would transform the government, now this is where we get interesting, into, quote, "a heavily armed, ultra-profitable corporation," end quote. The new regime would sell off public schools, destroy universities, abolish the press, and imprison, quote unquote, decivilized populations. I'm nearly finished. It would also fire civil servants en masse, a policy later called RAGE, retire all government employees, and discontinue international relations, including security guarantees, foreign aid, and mass immigration. So the focus on education, the focus on the idea of anything that's public and connected directly to education becomes a major orientation of this neo-reactionary movement, which is very active in Silicon Valley, and which many of the people who are engaged in leadership positions in these AI firms participate in, if you like, and
Sure.
pay some attention to. This is a whole reconfiguration of the ideological framework in which communication and media has taken place. And it's, in my own view, is that I see it as an extension of, and a pathetic extension, frankly, but an extension of the long history of anti-intellectualism in the United States. That those of us who are engaged in education, those of us who are engaged in intellectual work in the traditional sense of seeking to bring some kind of progressive change to society, and that's a very modest ambition, by the way.
Sure.
We're not legitimate. That is no longer a legitimate position. And if AI is seeking to reproduce that with this sort of notion of knowledge collapse, then I think we have some right to be pessimistic.
Yeah, I do. I agree. The ideological terms and really like you're saying, the entire structure in which the ideological terms operate is definitely being shifted, and it's not just by these sort of hardcore right wingers that often get the most press on the left. It's people like Yarvin and these Silicon Valley folks who now have the reins over many of our major media corporations as well, Skydance and Larry Ellison. They're buying up major media corporations, TikTok. So even the kind of legacy and new media are kind of in their control. So is this part of what you might talk about in your new class or the class you've taught on artificial intelligence in an evolving crisis? Is
Yes,
that is that some of
yes,
what you would discuss?
yes, but I haven't subjected, if you like, the students to the Yavin ideology. I've been a little bit cautious about wanting to throw them too far into that grinder, partly because I'm not entirely comfortable with it, and partly because I'm not sure that the foundations of comprehension, even for undergraduates, are quite there. We've got plenty else to talk about in
Sure.
terms of the history and development of technology and the impact on artificial intelligence through that political economy of communication. But certainly we talk about the challenges that are pretty much front and center of everyday life, including the impact of artificial intelligence on student work and on students' efforts to gain an education. And that is something we haven't yet addressed, but it's certainly
Yeah.
changing. Again, that's the change from culture to culture, where, AI offers a relatively straightforward solution, and that straightforward solution provides both convenience and efficiency. And often those two words come up. You might remember the book by, was it McGregor Wise and our colleague from Cultural Studies on the convenience culture, a culture
Yeah.
of convenience. And I think there's a second edition of that book. Sorry, Greg McGregor Wise, and he was a colleague of mine or a student of mine at UNC at Chapel Hill many years ago. So I beg his forgiveness for not getting his name right. But anyway, the notion of a culture of convenience, again, this manifestation of this trajectory of the culture that has been in play for a long time. And it's a very advanced notion of American culture, which is a culture of convenience. What could be more convenient than having to do a set of calculations or write an essay and be able to do it in 10 minutes rather than 10 hours, you know?
Well, and on top of that, there is this pressure within higher education, especially, to say this says this is part of what the workplace will look like, right? And being able to use these technologies, these tools, is part of what the workplace will look like. So you need to be able to use them, and there's a pressure to kind of not just sort of restrict that use, but actually to kind of engage that use, to sort of tell students you need to use it. And so it becomes, and there's that's the other sort of path that many schools are kind of engaging with, which is University of Ohio, I think, has a very big kind of connection, not necessarily with the AI industry, but with making students learn how to use these technologies, because it's part of job training now,
Right.
because that's what jobs will look like. So there's this, so that there's these two opposing, or like maybe contradictory sorts of pressures. You need to, tell students not to use it just out of convenience, but on the other hand, you really need to learn how to use it because it's going to be very important professionally. So those tensions are very live.
They're not only very live, it draws to my mind the fact that there are, and sadly, you know this as much as anybody else, significant efforts on the part of some universities to say certain areas of investigation, of inquiry, of research and teaching are no longer necessary.
Yeah, I'm
These are in
familiar
the
with that.
humanities, entire cultural departments, in philosophy departments, history departments. Why have these kinds of liberal arts orientated critical thinking enterprises within an institution when what you want is instrumentalized workers who simply know how to integrate themselves into the AI and then allow the AI to take over. And presumably that the scenario isn't an ideal one, but in terms of the impact on education, it's already there. And there is what was the data? 70, and this is the 70% of the United States population believe that, as far as I understand, higher education is heading in the wrong direction. This is a barely masked attack on humanities and on the traditions of critical thinking. I'm very fortunate. I work in Boston College, in a Jesuit institution. It has a long-standing tradition for the kind of things that make what they call Ignatian education valuable: reflection, critical thinking, men and women for others. These kinds of values haven't yet been jettisoned in this kind of institution. And there's enormous pressure on institutions to say, look, you should just forget these kinds of value-laden notions that are just 19th century, liberal notions. And this is real. I mean, it's real in establishing different ground rules in the political economy, because Trump says, we don't want these liberal ideas. We don't want these kinds of people in our institutions. Or, well, unless you're in some kind of elite category, then of course, all those people want their children to be able to appreciate literature and cinema and all those kind of nice things. But that's just a cultural expression and a cultural lifestyle matter for the upper 5-10%. The rest of the population be damned. They don't need critical thinking. They don't need any of this humanities orientated stuff, and the institutions are changing and adjusting as a result. Again, I used this term before, but again, I think there's an element where we can say that terror, along with other things, is being redefined.
So, if you were giving advice to other educators about integrating this technology, or having discussions with students about this technology, what has been your approach in this class, and how have students responded to this?
The approach has been to show them, firstly, the history of the discussions from way back in 1956 and the meetings that were held then up in New Hampshire and then at Dartmouth. And you can look at that document, very interesting document.
And these conversations, I think you mentioned this earlier. What specific conversations were these?
These are conversations where people who were in computer science and math at MIT and Harvard
Right.
said, we need to work out what's going on. Computerization was about to take off. I mean, it had taken off anyway, but about to take off, and they came up with this notion of, there's this thing called artificial intelligence. There was already the Turing test, right? Can
Right.
computers think? So what I do in the class is to say, let's read the Turing test documents. Let's read Turing's document. Let's read the documents from those early days preceding the 1956 days. And then, where are we in terms of understanding what those kinds of challenges look like now, and what kind of foundations should we think of for addressing these transformations in our relationship with knowledge, in our relationship with each other, when our relationships are increasingly mediated through machines. And that's where the political economy of communication comes in, and that's where structuration comes in, because what we do is to say that the structure agency question is pretty obvious. The structure of data management and data control is being refined and reduced into monopoly organizations that are then also reducing the capacity to engage with the breadth of human knowledge. And there's some literature about, this as a form of oppression. It doesn't include knowledge about colonization. It doesn't include knowledge about African Americans. It doesn't include knowledge about Indigenous people. So to inform students about what the change in structure means is useful, and for them to recognize it themselves, and to perhaps work on at least having that knowledge themselves once they've taken the course, but then also to recognize, well, what happens to agency? What kind of agency is there? And of course, one has to take seriously the notion of class and the notion of how the fact that our devices, and I'll hold up my little phone here, our devices have always addressed us as individuals, right? This is what these devices do, and this is the great success of the American capitalist model. It is reified and redefined the nature of our individuality in these machines. And AI just refines this even more. We're now, all subject, as the Cambridge Analytica case showed us, we're all subject to psychographics. You, Sean, have a profile somewhere. There's 3,000 to 4,000 data points about you and about every American citizen in the psychographic profiles. These are then being used within AI to address you and all your needs and all my needs. And we're supposed to be happy little, as they say in Australia, happy little Vegemites, happy little people. And this is just bullshit. And so what I try and do is to encourage students to recognize where the bullshit is, to recognize the incredible influence that is brought to bear through rhetoric and through marketing and through promotion, and then through the absolute bloody mindedness of corporate profit maximizers, and to say, how do we locate ourselves? How should we locate ourselves once we have this understanding and this knowledge? In a sense, to ask ourselves, can we be better people? And can we find, in Moscow's terms of structuration in the political economy, can we find those people, both in a class sense, but also in an identitarian sense, if you like, who are going to say no to these sorts of forces, no to the restructuring of social relations through machines. And it goes on from there. And from what I can tell, the students seem to find some pleasure in it, and that's great. If they don't, I can't help them.
Well, I think helping them see find out the bullshit and avoid the bullshit, that's one of the primary tasks of education, right? And I wonder about using these technologies, finding ways to sort of use these technologies against the grain. Do you see any possibilities for that, or?
This is purely speculative, but I am of the view that is being radically reduced, as
Okay.
opposed to what might have been. Remember when Google started? This is when I started working in technology back in 1990. Do no evil, right, or whatever it was, right? Do no harm.
Yes.
They were going to digitize the world's books. They were going to be free and available to everybody. All this knowledge was going to be unleashed. Think about AI now. None of that. None of that
Well,
is
I
on
think
the
about
agenda.
that moment when Google was digitizing the world's books, and there was a massive copyright lawsuit, and they said we can't do it anymore. Sorry, but now Facebook can take terabytes worth of pirated books to train its AI, and that's fine.
That's right.
So it's definitely a different environment, and I believe many of those CEOs in Silicon Valley are advocating the end of copyright or doing away with copyright for exactly that reason.
Right. Well,
So,
they've been
yeah.
extracting data for their own benefit for many years now, and without much permission or seeking much permission from anybody. And the neo-reactionary movement is part of this, that it gives enormous power to the companies that are producing and developing AI, and it creates slaves of the rest of us. And we saw some of this kind of discourse taking place before AI really took over. The idea of feudalism or digital feudalism emerging with the larger companies as they were then, and in some ways this doesn't even rise to the level of a sophisticated form of feudalism.
No.
It's more brutal, and it is genuinely reactionary and worth being aware of. And the other thing about education, of course, is that we have to also recognize that the ambitions to unmake education mean that there is a serious demand on educators to think about what they can do and to take action to defend their very livelihoods. Because the ultimate ideal of this, and some of my students have pointed this out in horror, is to have AI teach students. And there's a school in Texas already and other schools that are offering this to elementary children. Just turn on your laptop and there's your teacher, kids, and all your questions are answered. Where's the humanity there? Where's this sense of engagement, this deep immersion of human beings with each other in a classroom? Doesn't seem to me to exist, but that seems to be being offered as a solution. Why is it a solution? Well, it goes back to the political economy. Governments will not tax, they will not fund public education, and so it's all private all the time. And by the way, we've got a mechanical machine-like solution for you. And
Yes.
yeah, it's pretty disturbing. And whatever we can do to advocate for the public and to advocate against this kind of reactionary politics, the better. And I don't want to, in my classes, I don't want to sound like a broken record going over and over this. So I try and find ways to address it in ways that brings the students along.
Yeah. And that does make it does become difficult. There are a lot of doomsday scenarios that we're navigating on and offline, and so if that's the only frame, then sometimes it is easy to just turn off uh, and tune out, right? Um,
Well, I'm a great advocate, in fact, of the foundational notion within Marxism of how do we improve our social relations, right? That is the foundational notion of how we find our humanity. And
well,
in finding our humanity, we seek to say, what do we care about in social relations? Who are we with? What people are we engaging with? And how are we then organizing to overthrow those things that oppress us? There's nothing wrong with that as a pretty foundational notion, which then collides immediately with the machine-centric ideology of AI.
I think that's true, and on the flip side, I think the reason that it has gained so much purchase is that there is still this utopian understanding of it making our lives better, right? And making our connections better and making us smarter and able to kind of solve problems that we're all finding important, and that's in some ways the marketing is is not the kind of dark enlightenment Curtis Yarvin version of we need to go back to feudalism. The marketing is saying use this, it's going to be really helpful, it's going to kind of have us all be better workers, better people, and so that's I think part of the challenge that that you're finding here.
It could also be the fact that if were turn the criticism on its head and say we can actually see how AI can produce a set of social relations that are going to more closely resemble communism more quickly, let's get there and let's do it. We're going to have lots of information available. We're going to have it at a low cost. We won't have to work as much. There'll be enough money or wealth generated to give everybody a livelihood and to provide everybody in the world with food and shelter and all the basic essentials. We know that already.
Right.
Why can't we do it with AI? Why not? When we take over, Sean, we can do this. And it's
Okay.
possible that to rethink this radically is to say, okay, and this was always the case with the internet, right? To say, how are we going to identify utopianistic, super democratic engagement for every citizen? Didn't work out, but it's worth that
That's the
thought
vision.
experiment.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Marcus. I'm not sure that we'll get to speak with Brian, but I appreciate you joining us.
Welcome.
And we'll be taking the next 2 weeks off. Next week, I'll be traveling to Puerto Rico for the American Studies Association conference. And the Wednesday after that is generally a holiday for most U.S. academics, as it is the day before the national holiday of Thanksgiving. So when we return on December 3rd, 2025, we'll be continuing our discussion about AI and the remaking of our culture. We'll be speaking with Reed Van Schnick, about the use of memes, AI, and deepfake technology by the reactionary right to remake the world, and with Daniela Gatti, who is working on a queer theory of AI. So I'll send out reminders and an update as we get closer. Have a safe few weeks until then, and wish me luck on my border crossings. This episode will be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel. Please share it with your colleagues and let us know if you have ideas for future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive.com. Again, I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com. Until next time,